You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 382, recorded on June 12th, 2021. I'm your host, Bill Humphrey. Joining me on the line from Idaho is Rachel. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Bill.
And on the line from New York City is Kelley. Hi, Kelley.
Hi, Bill and Rachel. Thanks for having me.
This week's episode is on sewing machines in the first and second industrial revolution in the United States in particular. While textile weaving mills are one of the things most closely associated in the popular imagination when discussing the Industrial Revolution, it's time that we look at the next stage of the process in those related industries. After the textiles or fabrics have been woven on a loom, whether in a factory or at home by hand, they still need to be assembled together into clothing or food sacks or ship sails or whatever else. Or maybe you have a textile that will be used in a single piece as a curtain or a carpet, but it looks boring right now or it lacks decorative texture. Well, in either of these scenarios, you're going to want to use the prehistoric human technology of sewing one thing to another thing with some kind of needle and a stitching material like thread. And if you're at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution with the rise of mechanization happening all around you, it would certainly be great if you could sew those things together with less physical effort, faster, less expensively, and more repeatably with consistency. Fortunately, in the early 19th century, sewing joined weaving on the mechanization stage with the invention of a viable, widely adoptable sewing machine, first for industrial uses and then for home use by ordinary consumers. This development during the first Industrial Revolution radically changed the game for most people involved with the craft of sewing, either as seamstresses and tailors or as a home hobby or cottage industry producer. And then the field revolutionized yet again for basically everyone as one company emerged into the Second Industrial Revolution as the industry giant for the production and sale of sewing machines themselves, blazing a new trail not only for the clothing industry, but also the consumer credit sector and the arena of multinational American corporations. Now, before we get into this, I just want to note that we're not going to really get into the 20th century era for sewing machines in this episode. There's a lot of stuff that happens in the 20th century with sewing machines as well. Some of it's quite interesting, and I'll allude to it at the end of the episode again, but we are going to be limiting our focus to pretty much the 19th century for the purposes of this episode so that we don't get one that's super duper long. So let's talk a little bit about pre-Civil War sewing machines of the 18th and early to mid-19th centuries. So in 1755, there was a patent in the UK for a mechanical device to assist in sewing, but again, didn't really go anywhere particularly. In 1790, Thomas Saint, or Thomas Saint, I'm not sure, also in the UK, designed but failed to proliferate a sophisticated sewing machine for difficult leather and canvas stitching that needed precision. It was successfully built from his designs with minor refinements over 80 years later during the Second Industrial Revolution, sort of as a proof of concept to show that he had been on the right track, even if his particular design didn't really take off. But after 1790 and up until the 1830s, various British and American sewing and embroidery machines were developed and refined. And in 1830, and this is coming from the Britannica article on this, and as usual, our sources will be up in a PDF at arsenalfordemocracy.com. In 1830, Barthélemy Timonier in France invented the first widely used sewing machine intended for practical mechanical replacement of hand sewing. His crucial first major client was the French army under the newly installed July monarchy. And that, again, ties back to a lot of the stuff we've been talking about the role of the military and government spending on military purposes being critical to the development of a lot of these industries. Like we did our bonus episode on double-seamed canning and how canned goods became a major thing through things like the Napoleonic Wars and then the American Civil War and so on. However, Timonier's factory was torched the next year in 1831 by rioting tailors who feared that the labor-saving potential of these machines might lead to job losses. Now, of course, one of the things that will become clear as we do this episode is that, yes, in some ways, the sewing machines maybe cost some people their jobs, but broadly speaking, a lot of what happened was that you could all of a sudden produce a ton more stuff, which meant that you produced more stuff, not that you scaled back your business. So that actually, the machines often allowed people to produce much more in the way of finished goods and things like that. Now the question is, was that benefit being aggregated to the industrialists who could build a sewing factory to make these clothes. In 1832, shortly thereafter, American innovators began sort of studying these designs coming out of Europe, releasing their own designs for sewing machines and so forth, and then, of course, getting into huge fights over who was going to benefit from this. In 1846, eventually, after various designs of the 1830s, Elias Howe in Massachusetts patented a specific sewing machine design. After expensive patent theft lawsuits among various inventors and industrialists, the matter was resolved in 1856, half a decade before the American Civil War, through the use of a privately organized, not government-ordered patent pool. Now, I had not heard of this concept before, so I looked it up on the website of the World Intellectual Property Organization. And I wanted to quote from this as I think it's not only relevant, but it will become clear why this particular instance is so important. Patent pools can be defined as an agreement between two or more patent owners to license one or more of their patents to one another or to third parties. Often, patent pools are associated with complex technologies that require complementary patents in order to provide efficient technical solutions. Generally, these patent pools cover mature technologies, and then they give the counterexample. Pools also frequently represent the basis for industry standards that supply firms with the necessary technologies to develop compatible products and services. In that case, they rather concern technologies that are yet to be developed, end quote. So the idea here with the antebellum sewing machines in the United States and pooling the patents was that it would enrich everyone a lot more to share some of the design and parts patents and standardize the industry so that it could take off rapidly. If you hold the patent to one part of a sewing machine and someone else holds the patent to another part, neither of you is going to be able to combine them into a useful new design, except through costly licensing fees, unless you've pooled your patents to share the benefits. This impasse situation of overlapping patents on component elements of a bigger thing is called a patent thicket, and this was actually the first big one and remains sort of influential in the world of intellectual property and patent law. Patent pools today can, of course, be controversial because they are essentially collusion between competing companies, even if they might be good on balance. And this is sometimes referred to as the sewing machine war. And if you want to learn more about the sewing machine war of the 1850s in the patent system and the courts, the Arizona Law Review published a paper in 2011 on it, but I will note that it's arguing from a conservative perspective, favoring less interference by the government in overlapping patent disputes. So not really our perspective on this. One of the parties to the patent pool agreement in 1856, and we'll mention a few others. Obviously, one of the parties was Elias Howe, but sort of most critically, one of the parties was Isaac Merritt Singer, founder of the Singer Sewing Machine Company, who had entered the market in 1851. By 1860, the year before the American Civil War broke out, annual U.S. production of sewing machines had surpassed 110,000 units. So that agreement between the various companies and inventors in 1856 was really critical to this industry taking off. Now, Rachel, I wanted to go to you to talk about some of these different designs and some of these component parts that, really advanced the design and then subsequent production and sale of sewing machines. I didn't really talk too much about Hunt because he didn't patent his design, but he was also critical, along with these other guys like Howe and Singer and Wilson and so forth, in developing some of these specific subcomponent designs to sewing machines starting in 1832 in the United States.
Yeah, so Walter Hunt, like you said, never patented his designs, and then Elias Howe actually successfully patented his design in 1846. So, what their big innovation was the lock stitch. So, in this mechanism, there are two threads working at the same time. So, there's a curved needle that moves through the fabric, and then this thread from this curved needle that is actually moving interlocks with the second thread that is moved by a shuttle running back and forth on a track, like under where the fabric is getting worked on. And so something kind of interesting and not as recognizable to today's sewing enthusiasts is that Howe's machine held fabric vertically and it was powered by hand crank. So one of your hands was always engaged in powering the machine, and only one hand could actually move the work around. this lock stitch was pretty major because prior to this, machines used the chain stitch, and the chain stitch had quite a few limitations. It could only go in one direction. You couldn't change direction, or else the chain was broken. And also, if the chain is broken, the entire work just unravels. So this lock stitch using two threads is a lot more secure, and you can actually move direction as you're sewing. So Singer's machine actually came with a lot of the features that would be familiar to today's consumers. There's the vertically mounted needle. There's a foot that holds the fabric in place, and then even the foot treadle to power the needle's action is pretty familiar to today's consumers. So this foot treadle leaves both hands free to control the fabric. And Singer also used a falling shuttle to form the lock stitch. So Wilson, another one of these major inventors that formed the patent pool, invented a rotating hook mechanism to create his lock stitch. And this machine and this rotating hook technology that he invented in partnership with Wheeler was quieter and smoother, just because that rotating hook didn't have a lot of obviously back and forth motion, so it could just move in a lot smoother, easier motion. And Wilson also invented the quote unquote four motion feed that is used today. And so these innovations, the rotating hook and the four motion feed, made his machines the best sold of the 1850s and 1860s, just because they worked so much better than the competitors. So to explain this four motion feed, it's also known as a drop feed, and it uses quote unquote feed dogs to move the material past the needle. So the four motions are they move up through holes in the base of the machine to grip the fabric. They're serrated to have teeth to hold on the fabric, and then that foot helps hold the dogs and the fabric together. And so then the dogs move forward to move the material through the working parts of the machine, and then down to release the fabric, and then back to that starting position. And something big about this is while the needle is in the fabric, the dogs are down. So that way there's not interference from the dogs holding onto the fabric while the needle is engaging with the fabric. So it's pretty innovative, and this is actually how modern sewing machines work the fabric. So it's an enduring technology. It's very useful to this day. So as I said before, Singer's early machine used the foot treadle, which is a technology that has been used since the Middle Ages to convert up and down motion into rotary motion, and this powered the machine. Steam-powered machines were used as early as the 1850s, and as we said before, these machines were used in commercial sewing well before home use. And so these steam-powered machines produce men's clothing. As we stated in last week's episode, the beginnings of the modern ready-to-wear fashion industry started with men's clothing, like workwear, military uniforms, and so forth. And so these steam-powered machines were used for several decades, and then the first electric sewing machines were introduced in 1889 by Singer. So there were some diagrams of animal-powered machines and various other means of producing power, but the major ones are these foot-powered, steam-powered, and then electricity-powered sewing machines.
All right, so I'm going to go to Kelley now. We're mostly going to be talking here about the post-Civil War Second Industrial Revolution period, but obviously this really actually kicks off in 1856 with that patent pooling arrangement. And as alluded to earlier, one particular company, Singer Sewing Machines, it was the eventual name of it, that takes off as sort of the dominant player. Not exactly a monopoly, I think, but the major force in this particular industry. Now, as Kelley's about to explain, Isaac Merritt Singer, who we've talked about a little bit so far, was involved at the beginning of the company and then kind of gets sidelined a bit for reasons that will become obvious. And he became a rich man off of this, but a lot of the things that are associated with Singer, we're talking about the company rather than the person, because he didn't really have a lot to do with it. So Kelley, could you talk about some of the ways in which the Singer sewing machines and the company producing them sort of not only revolutionized the industry, but also really laid the groundwork for a whole bunch of other industries in a bunch of interesting ways.
Absolutely. So there, as Rachel has described, there was clearly the technology was getting better and better. There were advancements in the sewing machine itself, but there was nobody who was really taking this to market, able to mass distribute, able to make this a household item or even an enterprise item. And then along comes Mr. Isaac Merritt Singer, who had been born in upstate New York in 1811. He left home at the age of 12 and traveled with a troupe of actors, really dreamed of being an actor himself, took a bunch of odd jobs. Perhaps most notably in his personal life is that he had at least 22 different children with a variety of different partners. At one time, he was said to have 3 families with 3 different women who didn't know about each other. And he was also legally married to another woman. And so he clearly had a lot going on in his personal life. He left his first wife to become an actor. So he was quite a character, as these historical figures often are. But by 1850, he had more or less settled down in Boston, although still doing his multiple different partners thing, and was an inventor when a machinist asked him to help improve the sewing machine he had, which was a machine he had bought from Leroux and Blodgett Company. And so, like Rachel discussed, Singer's improvement was to add a presser foot for feeding the fabric and an arm-like apparatus that held the needle over the workspace, which reduced thread breakage and increased stitches per minute. So he got his first patent on this and was sort of in the sewing machine game very much by accident. As we'll talk about later on, this was sort of a seminal moment in invention for women, as it really brought a product to market that would directly benefit the role of women who had previously done much of the sewing at home. But he was not a feminist by any means. He did not go about setting out to make women's lives better. He just figured out a way to get rich, and even was quoted as saying that he cared about the dime and not about the invention. Because of his colorful personal life and his just general erratic nature, he got pushed to a more passive, quieter role in the company. And it was really Edward Clark who came up with many of the marketing and manufacturing ideas that we are going to talk about. Nonetheless, he became very, very wealthy in this passive role, was sort of paid just to like stay on the sidelines, and died a very wealthy man. As we dive into the Singer company itself, just to give you a sense of the rate of growth, I want to hit on a few key dates here. And later on, we'll talk more about the manufacturing technology that made this sort of growth possible. But by 1851, Singer had obtained his first sewing machine patent. Like Bill and Rachel just discussed, that was later compounded with other patents in 1856. By 1855, he won first prize at the Paris World Fair with his machine, which really introduced Singer to European markets. And by 1860, the Singer Manufacturing Company is the largest manufacturer of sewing machines in the world. So in less than a decade, he goes from getting asked to fix this guy's sewing machine to being the largest manufacturer of sewing machines in the world. And so as a result of this growth, Singer, which had primarily been an American company, needed to expand manufacturing. And they chose to open up a factory in Scotland because of their cheap labor, iron, and access to ports. In 1867, they opened up operations in Scotland, but by 1873, they had to move to an even bigger factory. And finally, in 1882, they opened up a factory in Clydebank, Scotland, which was made of 2 different buildings, each measuring 800 feet by 50 feet, 3 stories tall, with a marquee clock tower in the middle. Those factories were, at the time, the most modern factories in Europe, owning to the railway lines within the factory to bring items from one station in the assembly line to another. To building the factory was also built with fireproof materials and had a sprinkler system. And pretty soon the 3 stories just wasn't enough, and each of the buildings was expanded to 6 stories. The buildings were in use until 1980 and destroyed in 1998. So this was really at its peak. It was employing about 16,000 people in the area. This was really a huge factory and a modern factory in Europe, and very much a symbol of Singer's international prowess. It for a very short time it was only an American company, but quickly became one of America's first multinational corporations. By 1882, again, just 30 years after this original patent, they were in Singer Company was in Australia, New Zealand, Belgium, Switzerland, Germany, Austria-Hungary, France, Great Britain, India, Ireland, Italy, the Netherlands, the Ottoman Empire, the Balkans, Philippines, Portugal, Russia, South Africa, Scandinavia, Spain, and Portugal, and the United Kingdom. And by the early 1900s, they had entered Japan as well. To read a quote here, Singer enjoyed a global market share of a little less than 1/4 in the mid 1870s. However, by 1912, this had increased to 60% of the family sewing machines in America and probably 90% in foreign markets, an exceptional degree of market control. So what Singer did beyond just make sewing machines was really pioneer this international growth. Um, and they were able to do so because they had a product that everybody needed. They use many of the same marketing techniques we're going to discuss later on in each of these companies. They weren't necessarily catering to the individual company, but they knew they were good at manufacturing, and they knew they had marketing techniques that worked. And so they very much just copied and pasted those throughout the world in a very successful way until 90% of sewing machines in foreign markets were made by Singer. Bill is going to talk a little bit about the mass production techniques that made this sort of growth possible.
Yeah, so we talked last week, of course, about interchangeable parts and what a profound impact that had on the first industrial revolution, especially toward the end of it, and just the ability to make consistent machine parts that could be put together at scale. Obviously, that helps not only with your production lines for making whatever product it is you're doing, but it also helps you to make a consistent product. So you have the machines that make the machines, and then you have the machines themselves. Both of them involve interchangeable parts and mass production. Initially, not quite the assembly lines that we saw by the end of the 19th century, where you have, conveyor systems and things like that. But you'd still be able to break down the parts and say, okay, this person's going to work on this widget component of this product, and they're just going to keep making that over and over again and throw it in the bucket, and then someone else will assemble it and so forth. So sort of a low-tech version of the assembly lines that we saw later. The kind of growth in volume that Kelley was just describing with Singer, especially internationally, is not possible if you're making machines from scratch. And so the Singer's company, which, as we noted, pretty quickly pushed him to the side, and the name continued, but he didn't really have that much involvement with it. It did rely on templates, interchangeable parts, early assembly lines, and this cut the company's costs, it boosted profits, and also it allowed that production at a scale necessary to supply a home consumer market, not just to supply enterprises like factories, or sometimes you'd have someone that needed some industrial scale machines to do work for not massive production work in terms of volume, but they'd be working on like leather saddles and things like that, and so that you'd need sort of an industrial sized machine for that. But the interchangeable parts also allowed machines to be serviced and repaired, and this became a cornerstone of Singer's marketing and customer service strategy, which is really important to understanding how the company took off. It's not just that they could produce at volume. It's not just that they had this great quality product. It's all the other sort of ancillary things that they did around that. So again, to go back to Kelley's point about the sort of scale and speed of the takeoff, the production in the early 1850s was only 2,500 machines per year at Singer's company. and that rose to 13,000 machines by 1860. So already a pretty rapid jump, basically just on the strength of saying, okay, we've got a design, now let's make it infinitely repeatable with these interchangeable standardized parts. By 1876, the year after the founder's death, the company had sold its 2 millionth machine. So again, a pretty rapid takeoff. And by the mid-1880s, the company was producing some 8,000 machines per week in that Scottish factory alone. That factory went on, again, just that one factory, went on to make 36 million sewing machines by the 1940s. This interchangeable parts approach also simply allowed Singer, both the person and the company, to make smaller machines for the home instead of for the industrial factories or other businesses. And so Kelley is going to talk now some more about this consumer home market, which is really crucial to understanding not only how they were able to sell so many machines, but also what the broader implications were for society.
Yeah, so one of the really interesting things about this pooling of patents is that there were essentially 4 different groups with the same technology. And one of the reasons that Singer came to dominate those 4 groups and the sewing machine market in general is they had the best manufacturing, distribution, and marketing systems. Particularly Edward Clark, Singer's partner, who really came to run the business. Bill and I were joking that it probably should be called Clark, given that all Singer did was sort of get rich on the sidelines. He was very innovative in this marketing area. The sewing machines were initially too expensive for most families. They were about $100 at a time when the average annual income of a family was about $500. So they were much cheaper than they had ever been, much better than they had ever been, but also still generally too expensive for most families. So Edward Clark came up with the idea of a rent-to-own model, which would allow families access the machines, to use them, pay a $10 fee each month instead of a $100 lump sum, and then at the end of 10 months, they would own the machine. And so this pairing of relatively inexpensive machines with these financing plans really created a mass market of buyers across the country, as this was something that average households could now afford. Sort of a byproduct of this plan was that these salespeople and agents needed to go around every month to collect these $10 payments from the families. And so this created a pretty big sales force. And so this sales force of agents would come to your house. They would help you set up the machine. They would come back a few days later to make sure it was working. They would help you service the machine and replace parts, thanks to those replaceable parts that Bill just mentioned. And so this really became a model of customer service. You know, if you were buying a Singer machine, they were going to get it to work, and they were going to assist you in keeping it working, which was pretty significant for families making such a large investment to have a sewing machine at home. Other marketing improvements included these very fancy showrooms. They would put on these demonstrations in New York City where people were just amazed by how fast the machines work. They would buy up used sewing machines to prevent a secondary market. They didn't want you reselling your machine. They wanted everyone buying a new machine. They were also very efficient in the way they set up their business structure, with all of the salesmen essentially reporting to across the world, essentially reporting to headquarters in New York, with a very sort of standardized sales plan. And of course, like we've mentioned, just sort of unprecedented, aggressive international growth. But one of the legacies of Singer's marketing strategy, and one of their true innovations, was to market directly to women. The company used direct-to-consumer advertising, which was emerging after the Civil War as ad agencies began to set up shop and create ad campaigns to generate new demand. But they decided that their consumer was the woman in the family, who would have primarily been doing much of this sewing anyway. But as we know, this was an extremely sort of misogynistic time. And so to read a quote here, for a flavor of the attitude Stanton was up against, consider 2 cartoons. One shows a man asking why you would buy a sewing machine when you could simply marry one. In another, a salesman says women will get more time to, quote, improve their intellects. The absurdity was understood. So they were trying to sell an item that would make women's lives easier at a time when women did not have purchasing power, were not the decision makers in the family. So Singer began advertising their machines by stating that a woman with a machine could make over $1,000 a year with the machine, essentially promoting financial independence, and even said they would sell directly to the woman of the family, something that was very much unheard of at the time. So this sewing machine becomes sort of a key moment in the lives of women across the world as this invention is marketed to them and allows them to free up much of their time. I'm going to read a quote from a New York Times article from 1860 on the invention of the sewing machine. It's a bit long, but I think it does a good job sort of capturing the importance of this moment. No one invention has ever brought with it so great a relief for our mothers and daughters as these iron needle women. Indeed, it is the only invention that can be claimed chiefly for women's benefit. The inventive genius of man, ever alert to furnish the world with machinery for saving labor and cheapening the cost of manufactures, seemed to regard man as the only laborer prior to the invention of the sewing machine. The carpenter, with his planing, matching, and other machinery, was relieved from the drudgery of his trade, but on returning home at night, found no labor-saving machinery to relieve his wife in her toil with the needle. The farmer, with his reaper and threshing machine, gathers his harvest and prepares his grain for the market with 10 times the rapidity and ease that he could before these were invented. But his companion and helpmeet found no machinery to speed her labor or ease her toil until the advent of the sewing machine. For a long time, the machinery has been employed in the different walks of life to emancipate man from exhausting toil, to quicken the wheels of commerce over land and sea, and instead of depriving the labor of work, it has opened new fields of enterprise and led thousands into the road to wealth. And so this is a incredible moment for women. And when we look sort of at the arc of advertising overall, less than 100 years later, as we get into the 1950s, we will see a lot of these home machines, whether they be refrigerators or dishwashers or laundry machines, marketed directly towards women. So it is, of course, not lost on me that this 1816 New York Times article credits man with this device that makes women's life easier. But nonetheless, it was sort of a pivotal moment in the day-to-day life of women in America and across the world, as this tool greatly improved their efficiency for all of the sewing tasks that were just necessary in day-to-day life at the top that Bill mentioned. Bill is going to tell us a little bit more about where this story goes next.
Yeah, so now in a minute, Rachel is going to talk about how much more clothing physically could be produced and sold in the United States and elsewhere in the world as a result of sewing machines, especially the industrial ones. But it's important to understand that within the home market, it was not just a question of, women doing decorative sewing and embroidery and things like that. A lot of the women's sewing was things like stitching back on a button or repairing a piece of work clothing for her husband that had gotten a hole in it, or repairing her children's clothing, things like that. And many women in the period before sewing machines spent an enormous amount of their time at home just making repairs to keep a very limited number of articles of clothing in working, a viable condition to keep wearing for as long as possible, because it was extremely expensive to purchase and acquire clothing until things like the sewing machine greatly brought down the cost of clothing. But one of the big transformations for women with the sewing machine was not just that it saved them a huge amount of time in terms of the little sort of repair work that they were doing on a day-to-day basis, but that it actually turned them almost out of thin air into a untapped labor market. Women and girls who were stuck in the home, who couldn't for whatever reason, whether they were, a homemaker or they were disabled or something like that, if they had some reason why they couldn't get a mill job or some other similar type of job outside of the home, they could now be trained to produce a marketable piecework from home with sewing machines supplied by charitable wealthy women's organizations. And obviously, some of these women would be able to buy their own or do the rent-to-own scheme, but you also had women who that was just too far out of reach for them. And so you'd have these richer women forming these organizations to buy these machines for these other women who had less means so that they could then do this piecework, generate some extra income for themselves, and improve their situation in life. Earlier, Kelley mentioned about the sort of idea that you could be producing $1,000 worth of these goods per year by having one of these sewing machines. And so this was a market that previously was relatively untapped. Now, obviously, hand-stitched items had long been kind of a cottage industry, definitely in the modern era and the medieval era and so forth, but probably almost as long as sewing has existed, right? I mean, sewing is a thing that goes back to the Paleolithic era in the Stone Ages, and you can have someone say, okay, I'm going to sew this thing for you that you need if you bring me some food, right? That's a pretty standard sort of exchange that has probably existed for basically as long as humans and sewing has existed. But the question is, can you turn this into a really lucrative, marketable thing if you need this as kind of your side hustle in the 19th century? And Singer home machines made 900 stitches per minute, which was vastly faster and thus more marketable product could be produced than what someone could produce by hand. For comparison, an experienced seamstress, so sort of the expert level of this, as opposed to someone who was just doing basic repairs on articles of clothing for their husband and children, an expert seamstress would be doing about 40 stitches per minute by hand. And so this 900 stitches per minute just really opened up this whole new world. As we said, this was a hugely lucrative development for Isaac Singer, even if he was pushed to the side in the company because of his scandalous personal life. He was one of the earlier smaller scale tycoons of the Second Industrial Revolution. When he died in 1875, he had a fortune of $13 million in the money of the time. Today, that would be probably around $300 million or somewhat significantly north of $300 million, depending on what source you use to or what methodology you use to calculate that. For comparison, however, Cornelius Vanderbilt, the railroad tycoon, died in 1877, 2 years later, with about $105 million, which today would be worth at least $200 billion, according to the sources that I read. One other thing regarding the sort of transition from the 1850s sewing machine patent wars into this much more dominant industrial period and mass production, I did want to talk briefly about Wheeler and Wilson. So before Singer became the dominant player, and I mean that in the sense of the company, not the person, before Singer as a company became the dominant player in this industry, through the power of their consumer marketing and their sales force and their repair teams and their consumer credit financing options and things like that Kelley's talked about, Wheeler and Wilson, as alluded to earlier by Rachel, were the biggest sewing machine producers after developing that technology for the four-motion feed mechanism, which could smoothly sew forward, back, up, and down, thus allowing for very complicated tight stitching around things like buttonholes. But as a good example of the 1850s patent thicket mentioned earlier, a different inventor actually held the specific patent for lateral motion sewing in a sewing machine for use in, specifically, stitching buttonholes. And Wheeler and Wilson were thus part of the patent pool agreement of 1856, and so those technologies were then incorporated into those Singer machines. So you could do not only the very complicated home repair sewing work, but you could also have really fast industrial production of things like shirts, because all of a sudden you didn't need to have someone do hand stitching around a buttonhole. You could just have it come off of a factory line as a basically fully completed shirt or you could make the individual parts and then have someone use another machine to sew those parts together to finish your shirt. So Rachel, before we wrap up the episode, could you talk a little bit about this sort of industrialization of the actual production of clothing? Obviously, as I said at the beginning of the episode, we've talked a lot about weaving in the sense of making the fabric, but then you still need someone to actually sew it together into an article of clothing. And that was previously very expensive and very time consuming.
Yeah, a major thing about industrial sewing is it really cut down the time needed to make an article of clothing from months down to weeks or even days, or even for simple garments down to just a few hours. And so this really revolutionized industrial production because factories could mass produce these finished off the rack clothing for what is newly created at the end of the 19th century department stores. So you can just have these massive stores of selling ready to wear, standardized sized clothing in a store with many other types of consumer goods as well. And then there's all the marketing that goes with the department store, kind of ties into those ad campaigns that are just kind of starting out to target women consumers who have more free time to purchase clothing. And also, another big part of the home sewing aspect of the market is there's all these women's magazines that proliferate during this time. And they often include like sewing patterns for women, fairly easy to sew simple garments for home sewing as well. So just at this point in time, the number of articles of clothing that a person owns just kind of explodes. You used to have like your Sunday best and your work clothes, and that was basically it. But now at this point, it becomes cheaper and easier and faster to own many different outfits for many different occasions. And that also feeds into that ad campaigns as well. Like, then you have to own an outfit for an occasion and wear it once or just a few times. There's like more specialized clothing for certain events. And so this has obviously become an issue now for consumer consumption or for clothing consumption and waste issues. But at this time, we're not going to go into that. But so it really kind of opened up the consumer market for clothing at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries.
And unsurprisingly, within this explosion of clothing articles and ready to wear, we see men's clothing first, then women's clothing, partly as a fashion thing too, right? You know, you say, okay, here's the thing that men wear to work, or the thing that men wear to the office, with the rise of these sort of middle class paperwork office jobs in the mid 19th century starting. Still, you'd have a relatively limited number of things that a man would be expected to wear, and they could wear them over and over again. Whereas you alluded to, Rachel, with fashion on the women's side, it would be like, oh, just wear this like to one party if you're a rich person, or, you know, wear it a few times, or, you know, that trend was still more in the very fancy sort of high-end cultural stuff with the hand sewing up until toward the end of the 19th century, when it started to cross over for women as well. Now, as noted at the beginning of the episode, we're not going to get into the 20th century era for sewing machines in this episode. That would get us too far off topic for today, as the machines got a lot more complicated and started moving toward computerization and electronic components. Interestingly, though, many of the older mechanical sewing machines before these gizmos were added had working lifespans of up to 100 years, well into the 20th century, and that was, of course, back before the planned obsolescence days, which we covered on our bonus episode in the beginning of January 2021. Before we close out here, I guess I'll go back to you, Kelley, for your sort of wrap-up thoughts about this fascinating thing where the sewing machine not only was revolutionizing sewing itself, but also all these other ancillary corporate things and marketing and advertising and finance and all that.
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised by how many sort of business school articles there have been written about sewing machines, but it is because the Singer Company was so innovative in the way that they marketed, manufactured, and distributed their products. And really left us with the legacy of multinational corporations that we have today. And the final thing that I'll mention is that I just think that this proliferation of getting sewing machines into houses just foreshadowed so much of the sort of marketing and home machinery that would take place in the next century.
Rachel, your wrap-up thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's interesting how sewing machines kind of journeyed from the industrial sphere into the home sphere, which is kind of backwards from how we've seen like other processes like weaving started out in the home and then moved into the factory. So it kind of created this artisanal home industry that just really didn't exist before. You had to hand sew or hire a seamstress to make your clothes. So it's really interesting how the machines moved out of the factory into the home in kind of a backwards direction.
Yeah, I mean, there definitely was some amount of the cottage industry activity, as I said, but like you said, just the scale explodes enormously in terms of what can be produced in the home that other people might want to buy. That was just totally unprecedented if you were not this sort of really expert seamstress where that was pretty much your main thing. Okay, well, Rachel, thank you so much for coming on this week to talk about sewing machines.
Thanks for having me.
And Kelley, thank you for all of your work and detailed research into this as well.
Thanks for having me, Bill.